Okay. I prepared a paper keynote. Okay, let me first maybe say something especially for Mike about gamification, but very shortly. I won't go into all the projects because I suppose you've seen them all yesterday already, right? Gamification, in short, is using game design elements or game design thinking to enhance empowerment, engagement, mastery, autonomy, both by promoting free play, so just messing around, trying things out, and as well as hard play, which is really trying to overcome very hard obstacles. And one of my favorite definitions of what a game actually is the voluntary effort to overcome unnecessary obstacles. Now that's a game. If you would translate that to society, that would mean a voluntary effort to overcome necessary obstacles. That almost sounds like work, doesn't it? So hard play tries to really tackle those obstacles. Free play is more about trying to figure out how things work. And I will talk about that in respect to these aspects. Now let's start off with attitude. It's right here. When it comes to translating the idea of gamification to an attitude in education, I propose that there should be more play space for a bottom-up approach in education. Which literally means that right now I think the educational system is still based very much on how it was shaped over the years when the Hogeschool Rotterdam was really in a crisis and was not making any money, and they had to really put full control on everything they did just to streamline everything. Now it's all fine, we're doing fine, I hope. But that means we can let go of control a little bit. Now the problem is almost like what happened with South Africa, where they said, okay, we should let the black people also be part of the government, but Jesus, if we give them power, they will kick us out first thing. We will no longer be necessary. The same sort of thing is going on in education. And it is therefore very important to organize this sort of freedom, to make sure that it's done in the right way. And if you look at reports from the government, the WRR, for instance, has a very nice report on that, they talk about competent rebels, which means that there should be people that are willing to challenge the status quo, to find new ways for education, for a more bottom-up approach, but sanctioned top-down. So therefore, what is very important, keywords here, are play space, exploration, trying things out, and if you fail, fine, because we're exploring, we're experimenting, we don't know yet what the new education will work out like. Empowerment of teachers and students to do so. Trust, I think, is maybe the main keyword here. Because if you don't know what the hell you're doing, you got to have a lot of trust in yourself. And I think also top-down now, there is this shift towards, hey, we should put power back to the teachers. But yeah, of course, you can just say, okay, do whatever you want, but that's also not going to work. So, who are the sort of front runners? Who are the rebels that are competent enough already to be trusted to do so? And for instance, there's a small group that I'm part of now, Invasi, we call ourselves Invasion, and we're trying to do just that thing, to actually at different places within the Hogeschool, within the University of Rotterdam, to see where all those initiatives are, to stimulate them, to promote them, to maybe help them out with extra knowledge and extra skills, because there's a lot of teachers right now that really want to make a change, but they somehow lack the network, and they lack sometimes the educational skills, the didactic skills, and we can very simply help them out. So, play space for a bottom-up transformation of education. The second one, knowledge. If you look at game play, there's one very interesting thing, because I don't see gamification as just making something look like a game. It has to be at its core, you have to use some game mechanics. And what is it that the youth of today is very good at least to a certain extent, that they're native at, because they're digital natives, is to see patterns. If you're playing a game and you're constantly messing up, you do that because by messing up, you can see what happens if I do this, if I do that, if I do this, and therefore I recognize the pattern, and then I have sort of a metacognition that I can use to then get further in that game. And I think that's what we need more and more, because education is preparing us, as we all know, for something we don't know yet what's going to happen. Things might change dramatically in 3 years' time, and how are we going to prepare for that? So we'll need to, I think, really work on the meta skills of students more, survival skills, I would almost say. And therefore also, again, trust them to do the right thing when they're taking the liberty to mess up. So keywords here are, for instance, adaptive learning, ownership, pattern recognition, meta skills, and last but not least, I think when we're talking about knowledge, we already did some tryouts in Levine's lessons in gamification, and we asked the students simply, okay, we've given you some speakers, some talks, now you're further up in the process towards the end. What do you need? Who are your heroes? Who would you like to invite? And we just gave them a budget, the trust, the empowerment, to say, suit yourself, organize it yourself. And that was really fantastic because we got a lot of positive feedback. I mean, we did a whole feedback survey, and some things that were said, for instance, by Nicole, who's sitting right there, was, I'll say it in Dutch, goed dat ik in het begin de gastlezers wel geregeld waren, waardoor ik nu veel beter wist wat voor gastlezers ik nog zou willen zien. Ook goed dat iedereen die wilde mocht gaan pitchen voor een gastlezer en dat vervolgens klassikaal gestemd werd. So one could pitch for a speaker, and then if they got the votes from all the students, a sort of, crowdfunding in a way of votes, then that speaker would be invited. And that meant that the whole class was really serious about getting that person in. So then everybody came, well, at least the people interested, came to that speaker. And so the engagement and the ownership of knowledge at that point was a lot bigger. And this is very closely related to what happens in games. If you're playing a game and you're constantly messing up, that's fine, that's how you learn. But if you stop learning, that's when you need some extra knowledge. Like, shit, I can't get further. So what do most digital natives right now do? Go online and ask. Ask the right platform about the right questions. Or just ask their peer experts. Oh, you're already 5 levels ahead. How did you do it? What did you encounter? And these are the sort of ways to go about sharing knowledge. I think that is going to be more and more part of education, and therefore we should, again, empower the students to do so. Methods. We already talked about the way students sort of gobble up knowledge when they need to. There's an interesting article by Mizuko Ito, a book basically also. It's called Hang Around, Mess Around, Geek Out. And this is the outcome of a very large survey of American young digital natives and the way that they learn online. So when we're talking about gamification, we're also talking about digital culture, not only, but also. And one of the interesting things is that this is sort of the order, or sometimes they happen at the same time, in which they learn online. Hanging out is just being there, socializing, networking. But then, not actually learning a lot of skills and knowledge and then trying to figure out what to do with that, which still is a little bit the status quo of education, but the other way around, just messing around, toying around with YouTube, putting the wrong video on the wrong time, forgetting price settings are all fucked up, and then you start learning because people tell you, hey, I just saw you naked, oh, I didn't mean to, and of course, we as teachers still feel like we have to protect them and make them control their environment, but they don't want to, they want to mess around, that's how they learn. And once they mess around enough, that's where you get to the stage of geeking out, where you go like, okay, now I get it. Now I'm really into this. Now I figured it out, I mastered this. And this is very closely related to gamification, where also you had these, I already told you about the sort of free play and hard play. You could say that we first could start playing around with things, toying around with things, just fucking around with things. And then later on, when you really feel that you're onto something, that's where the mastery comes in. That's where the hard play comes in. You're trying to fix those problems that you can't seem to solve. But the sort of digital learning method, this self-directed learning that comes from this new digital lifestyle, is very, very useful in that respect. And I think we should not so much as just completely go overboard and only do that. I think it's still interesting to give some basic knowledge of things at the beginning, but also to give, again, a lot of space for this. So keywords here are methods on demand, as we already did, online learning, self-directed learning, peer learning, very important, learning from your peers. In this report, it was very apparent that teachers are actually just a nuisance. They're just in the way of learning. Right? But once you get to the hard play, where you really start to geek out, that's where grown-ups, not necessarily teachers, but grown-ups start to become more interesting, because then they are the masters that you seek out to get just that specific knowledge that you need. And therefore, maybe you could even boldly say that maybe we shouldn't even try to get students to get a better education that looks like how they do online learning, but to maybe say that education is just one of the things that is helping students do self-directed learning. So we're just one of the sources now instead of the source of it. Then, facilities. We did some experiments in the same space that you talked about op Zuidplein, where we asked the students to come up with the rules of the game of their own ideal school. Now, this is a very bold experiment if you only have 1 hour a week with these students, so I can already tell you there's not that much ownership in 1 hour a week, but actually, so far they were very, very happy because it was meaningful. It was something that they really cared about because they, hate school. They don't like the school building. It's completely uncreative. This is the only art school that doesn't look like an art school. That will change, of course, but right now it's not, if you get the stats, it's not that great. But they are very interested in how it could be better. But you have to really break through the sort of status quo where they think, well, nothing will ever change anyway. The FADI, the facilitary management, they're just sort of Nazis, and they're just, whatever we do, we hang out with something. I even remember hearing the story, I don't know if it's true, that they ripped off a classic poster in Roger's office and put it in the trash can because the paper might go on fire.
That's not true.
Not true? Okay. Well, it was a very nice lie then. Now, when we did this experiment with make your own space, I got the facilitary management as the client itself, and they now got really, really enthusiastic about the outcome because students and teachers, when properly guided, coached, can really come up with very interesting new concepts and principles and rules of play of how to go about a space like this, for instance. And it's an ongoing experiment, but it was so well received that the method that I use for it, which I won't explain here now, but it's here, is now being used to completely refurbish an entirely new building at Kralingse Zoom, which is gigantic, and we already changed a building at the Museum Park, where we, in co-creation with the teachers and the students, go through 3 sessions, which is actually enough to come up with the principles that are then given to the architect and interior architect and say, hey, as long as these principles stand, do whatever you like. So we're not trying to be interior architects here, but we do try to come up with principles. And how do we do that? Again, by seeing the patterns, by looking at our environment and really trying to figure out what's the essence here. Keywords. Shared vision. That is very necessary. You can't just go and say, do whatever you like, because you immediately get stuck. I tried that in the beginning. We too were stuck because if you say everything's possible, it's so much freedom that you can't really handle it in a way. You need to frame it somehow. And by framing it, I mean we used 4 metaphors: the wild, the pub, the attic, and the workspace, to make the students aware it's not about I need a quiet space or I need a busy space. No, you need both, but at different times in the learning circle. So I devised a learning journey, as it were, which is very closely related again to player journey in gamification. And that gave them a sort of a roadmap to look at their own process and what space fits best. And that works quite well. So shared vision in that respect, co-creation, organized freedom, empowerment, and facilitation. And what I would really like to state here is that what was interesting for facility management is that I was able to convince them that they should stop focusing on managing facilities, because to be honest, when you really talk not to the director but the people at the work floor, most of them would really just basically like to screw everything to the floor so it wouldn't move, and you just hose it down with sort of antiseptic at the end of the day, and your job is done. You know, the sort of toilets that sort of clean themselves on the inside? That would be their ideal school. You just push the button and the thing self-cleans. But that's no longer what we need, of course, in education, especially in creative education. So I propose a shift towards facilitating learning instead of managing the facilities itself. And that brings us to entrepreneurship, because that example explains a little bit how gamification, especially in the social context, education being the social context here, is very valuable and actually makes money. Therefore, also here says more experience, more money. We're now living, as you might know, in the experience economy, which means first we had products, then we had services, now we have experiences or even transformations. And the more you go towards experience or transformation, the more people are willing to spend money on this, because it becomes more and more part of them instead of just something that is there. And when I propose a shift from managing facilities to facilitating learning, this solved a huge problem for them, because right now, it started somewhere in the 80s, facility management, and hasn't developed since. It's still the same format that came over from the USA at that point. But right now, the government is spending less and less money on education. So what gets the first cuts? You can imagine facility management. Why? Because before they focused just on safety and they focus on hygiene. Is it clean? Can you eat from the floor? Fine, that's what we do. But if you do that every day, you can cut on the liquid that you use to clean, you can cut on people because you can do it a bit more efficiently, but more and more that made it become invisible, unpersonal, and even suppressive. You know, a lot of people really feel like they're sort of the guards, the watchers. They're not those people there trying to help you. Know, they're trying to keep an eye on you, see if you don't do anything wrong. It's sort of like your mother, and sorry, or father if that's the case. There's a lot of fathers like that. And this experiment showed that if you make facility management a real important part, again, of education, suddenly you're an experience instead of a service or product. And therefore, you can ask for subsidies and finances from completely different directions than just keeping things clean. And so for them, it really is a reframing that will lead to a new business model. Actually, the old business model that they had before the 80s, but then reinvented here now and then in this day and age. And they've now even merged as a service with online tool management, which is completely new to them. So you could even think that looking at the learning journey and the spaces you need, the same spaces apply to online learning as well. A place for sharing, or a place for contemplation, or a place for working. You have the online equivalents for that already. So the model actually will also help them to make that transition into the digital facilitation of learning. Keywords here are value creation, user experience, experience economy, reframing, and last but not least, perks, because we thought, well, entrepreneurship, that's all great. Apart from this story about facility management and experience economy, gamification is part of experience strategies as a domain, so it makes complete sense to look at the experience economy that way, and therefore see your added value even for such a thing as education or any other social practice. But we also thought some of these ideas, for instance Nicole's idea as an example, were then adopted by clients. They're actually going to produce it. And what I noticed then is that this sort of entrepreneurship that comes from that, I hope, right? Of like, hey, I'm going to get this this product out, this service out, which is a game for school, you know. We are not actually well equipped to facilitate that part. And there's a very good reason for it, I found out, and that is that the school, the vision is that the school cannot be competition for the field, for the work field around us. We cannot be competition of studios here in the city. So how do we go about this? How can you, in one way, want to be an entrepreneur, and in the other way, no, stop at the concept, don't develop any further. And there's really, I racked my brain over this. And in the end I thought, well, if you look at a day like today, where the students that really are entrepreneurial, if I can say it this way, and came up with really great solutions that are ready for the next step, you are here, right? This is an interesting place for you to share. Yesterday you were on stage, you were able to invite, again, knowledge on demand, tools on demand, experts on demand. In games you would call that a perk, a privilege, you could say. If you do really well, you add up points. Now points don't mean a thing, of course, but because you don't want to then get a bar of chocolate. There's a lot of schools right now handing out trips, you know, to get a sail trip. I think in Holland actually tried it and then were called back because you're not allowed to give a student a sailboat trip because he's having such great grades. So that gamification will work. But, and I think it's actually really bad gamification as well, but a perk, something like if you do well, you'll get something extra that will help you go further. Then I think we hit upon entrepreneurship. To empower again the student to continue on his own without too much of our facilitation. Because you invited the experts yesterday, so we didn't need to do that. So if we are not equipped for it, why even try to be equipped for it? Empower the students to do it on their own. So handing out these perks, and I can imagine many other perks, could be very interesting. And it's one of the methods actually that comes from gamification now. We asked the students of the minor gamification to gamify the minor for next year, because why should I do that? Of course I'm willing to do it, but it would be very interesting to see how students go about it, because they are very user-centered, because they are the users. And a lot of very interesting ideas came out of that. And perks are a very big part of that. The idea that I'm willing to do more, but what do you get in return? Just 7 instead of 6, who cares? But if I get to be here with an expert that is actually maybe sort of launching my career, hell, I'm going to work hard, I'm going to play hard. And I think that's going to be very interesting to do that for entrepreneurship. So by first playing around, messing around, learning your own skills, and we are just facilitating that, and then when you're ready to play hard, why not take the next step and hand over the power to the student. That's it?
Right.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Keep it short. I really like the idea that a shift in thinking creates opportunities. Really interesting. I was just wondering what Diana was talking about. Where's the design aesthetics? Because you seem to be talking a lot about creating opportunities by a different way of thinking, different way of approaching education. But you talked about in the Make Your Space thing with the Fadi.
Yeah.
You also said we recognize patterns defining the need for spaces, and then hand it over to the architect, because we're not architects, but we are training architects. So I thought that as well. So why not use them?
Exactly. Well, Christina here, I don't know if you saw her show yesterday. She is doing just that, but that's because that's her profession. So she's doing that. But you know, a graphic designer is not doing that. So depends very much on if you want to continue with that or not.
It's interesting in the thinking of interdisciplinary work and so on. So, what if a graphic designer would go into it?
It would be interesting, definitely. So I'm very open to anybody. Basically,
Or
product
engaging.
designers can also really become part of this. And there have been students that designed prototypes for chairs that you can sit outside, but then fold and put back, and they made up the rules of what happens if somebody steals, something, etc. Yes, this is all very much possible. The shame is, though, right now in this module we only have an hour a week.
What would be your ideal in that sense? Because you have you developed sort of a model for a new school in a sense. That's the impression I get. So
Well, not a model for a new school, but a process to develop your own school,
Yeah.
and ideally over and over again. So my dream, or maybe next step, basically, is to come up with a formula in which there are certain parts we don't need to reinvent the wheel every day. So especially when it is about safety and hygiene. I mean, toilets, come on, we don't really need to think about that. So that can become, I would call it sort of the pizza metaphor. I could say to students, whenever there's a new space, and there's a lot of temporary spaces that have to be used in the next time. So I would say, here's the bottom, what's that? The bottom. There's maybe 3 types of bottom, right? Thin, crispy, or thick, or maybe folded.
Yeah.
You know, that are sort of main spaces and the main infrastructure of the spaces. And then choose your topics from this catalog. This has already been developed as prototypes by students. Would you like that? We can make them for you, because the we already invest now about 20,000 euros into creating prototypes of different kinds, so that's pretty cool. But at the same time, inviting them also, if you want to expand the catalog, please feel free to do so. And yeah, we'd love to make that catalog and continue it, and therefore have not so much an end solution, but a process to keep reinventing the school, because one of the things the sanitary management asks is, that's all great, but do we need to reinvent this every week, because that's going to mess a little bit with our planning habit, can't we just get something for the next 5 or 10 years and fix it? I said, no, not everything. So this pizza model might help them to say, okay, this you can just roll out for the next 5 years, but this, every year, start from scratch. And maybe, hopefully, now we have all this prototype, so I'm going to ask them to free up a basement somewhere. They have some. They have some basements, and to just then sort of, because then you create sort of a pop-up school. You can just everything is actually made so that you can collapse it, so you can move it into the basement, including the little library and everything. And then whenever we have a new space available, just pop it out. And
I'd love to talk to you more about it, because this is a translation towards a very practical implementation of the system or the facility. Whereas at the same time you're actually explaining a mentality that could be imposed on the entire school, and has some other possible implications that might be very interesting, and especially the interdisciplinary, or the idea that everyone is working interdisciplinary, and this refers also to your other presentation. I'm still trying to find out in what way this happened, in what way you are still working within your disciplinary, but only working on general topics, or if the disciplines itself can disintegrate or can merge or whatever. So I'm curious, but that is something maybe to discuss later.
Yes. The only thing I could say is that interdisciplinary way of working on, for